by what they've read and seen since, describing essentially what they remember.
Yeah.
It's just a nice part of the world. It really is. Yeah.
Everybody's so helpful.
Hang on now. Let's see how our Tinker Toys are all put together here. Have we got any kind of an audio now?
Yeah, if you just want to give me a little bit of...
Glenn, would you just say a couple things? Okay, first of all, the phone was ringing, right?
Okay, the way I became involved in this was started out in the early afternoon, around probably 1:30 in the afternoon, and I received a telephone call from the mortuary officer out at the Walker Air Force Base, Army Airfield Base, and he was inquiring about what would be the smallest possible casket that we could get that would be hermetically sealed. And at that time, I know that we had used like the 4 feet and caskets. We had used those before, but I thought they also made them in a 3/6. So, but he wanted to know if we had any in stock, and I said no, but if I can make a call to Amarillo, I can have him in, by 7 o'clock the next morning on a truck. So he said, I'll get back to you. And that was the first contact that I had with the base.
And then what?
Then he called back, probably 45 minutes or so later. And he said, I need to ask you some more questions. He said, in case something like this should happen, he said, we need to know what the preparation, what your preparations are for the bodies that had been laying out in the elements, And he said, we need to know also what if your treatments of the bodies are the remains, what could you do to them, and if your treatments, would it change any of the chemical breakdown of the tissues, the blood? Would it make a difference? And I said, I thought probably it would. And I said, of course, he knew exactly how we would treat those bodies because we have an outline from them and what we really have to do. I think he already at that point knew exactly what we would have to do.
Did he disclose to you what he had?
No, I told him. I said, if you have a problem, if you want, if you have something you don't really know what to do about it, let me come out, and I'll, try to help you do whatever you want to do.
And he said.
And he said.
Okay.
And he said no. He said.
Let's just back up just a minute there. Let's start again with you were saying you told him that you can come out and take care of what he had, right?
Yeah.
Why don't you pick it up from that point again?
So, anyway, he said, well, we don't really have anything. He said, we're sitting here thinking in case we should get involved in something like this, what would be our preparation? What should we do? Then I went through, I said, do you really want to know how we would do it? Well, yes, we would like to know. So that's when I explained to him that we would have the vats that we would fill up with formaldehyde solution with water, and we put the bodies in them, let them stay there for 24 hours, and then take them out. And then we would pack the bodies in, would be a sawdust and really a lime, what we would pack them in, then wrap them in the plastic. That's bodies that were badly decomposed. If there was tissue, deep tissue, we would have to do it hypodermically with needles to get to the deep tissue. Then we would have to aspirate the cavities if the cavities hadn't already ruptured, and then put some cavity fluid in those. I said that's, kind of normal procedure.
Now, at one point, you finally offered to take care of it for them.
Well, I offered 2-3 times, yeah.
Can you review that conversation from that point?
You mean when I offered to take care of them?
Yeah.
he said, well, we don't really, right at this time, we don't really need your assistance, but he said, in case something like this should happen, then he said we would be prepared and we would know what to do. Then we got back onto the subject of maybe not damaging any of the chemicals, compounds or anything with the bodies, or tissues, whatever, because and they wanted, how would you pick bodies up like that, and what would you do not to contaminate any of it?
Didn't this begin to seem a little strange to you at that point?
Well, I thought maybe what happened, they might have had a VIP or, some officer and something that happened. They didn't want, wanted to keep it quiet, and they probably wanted to do it themselves and not be involved with the civilian businesses or anything.
So after these conversations, you were curious, and you went on out to the base, as I understand it. Can you review that?
Well, no, I didn't go out to the base. Yeah, I was curious, but I didn't go out to the base, and probably a couple hours later, then I'd got an emergency call. There was an airman that was injured in an accident, and I took the airman to the base. He rode in the ambulance with me, and I took him out to the emergency room, and that's the way I became really involved out the base. I didn't go out just because I was curious.
Give me the sequence from the time you picked up the airman and just describe to me.
Well, when I got the call, I left the funeral home, and the ambulance went to the scene of the accident, picked the airman up. I did not place him on a stretcher because he had a head injury in the nose. I think his nose was fractured. So I did some minor first aid, and then he sat in the front seat with me all the way to the base. When we got to the base, then he walked into the emergency room. I didn't have to take him in. They didn't bring out a gurney or anything. He just walked in on his own. Then I never did see him after that. Then I had this friend that I wanted to talk to and see. This is a lieutenant nurse that I knew quite well, that had only been there only been commissioned and been out to sign. This was her first assignment out to the air base. And I wanted to talk to her, and so I was going down the hall, and first thing, the lieutenant that I wanted to see was coming out of one room, going across the hall to the other, and she noticed it was me. She said, "How did you get in here, and what are you doing in here?" And she said, "You better get out in a hurry." She said, "You're going to get in a lot of trouble." She said, "Would you please leave and get out of here in a hurry?" And then I turned around, and she went on into the other room. Then in about the time I turned around, there was another officer said, "Hey, wait a minute." And I said, "Looks like you had a crash." He said, "I see there's some, in the ambulances out there, I see a lot of wreckage." And I said, "Where was the crash?" And he said, "There wasn't any crash." And he said, "Just wait a minute." And then he said, "Wait a minute." And I, stood there for a minute. And he turned around, and evidently he must have waited for somebody else to come out, because there was another officer coming out. He said, "This man says there was a crash out at the base." He said he wanted to know he was inquiring about our crash. And this was when I encountered, he was a red-headed officer, and very nasty, very rough. He said, "You did not see any crash. There was not any crash." And he said, "You get the hell out of here, and you didn't see anything, and you don't talk to anybody." He said, "You're going to get in a hell of a lot of trouble." And I said, "Look, I'm a civilian. There isn't a damn thing you can do to me about it." He said, "No, but somebody might be picking your bones out of the sand." That's when he made the remark there. Then there was a black sergeant that was standing beside him, and he said, "Yeah, but he would make better dog food for our dogs." Of course, I didn't understand that, but my father happened to be an old trapper and for a hobby and everything. And I said, "My father uses guys like you for bait in these coyote traps." And then there was two MPs that joined me right on, took me outside, and each holding me by my elbows, and they escorted me out back to the ambulance and followed me all the way back to the funeral home.
Now, as you were entering the hospital, you saw something in 3 trucks.
Yeah, because usually where I parked, there was 3 field ambulances parked in the area where I usually park where we back up to the ramps. So I just pulled up to the side in front of those and parked out in the front, and the airman and I got out and walked in. So when I got up, went up the steps and up the ramp, and I was walking, going into the emergency room, I noticed that the doors were open, but what was odd about it, there was an MP standing beside each one of the vehicles in the back, just standing there. And the doors were open. Naturally, I was curious, and I just happened to look in. That's when I saw some debris that looked like parts of a plane or something that they hadn't had a crash. Because I've seen them do this a lot of times, bring in pieces and the old ambulances in.
Can you describe the debris?
Yeah, I noticed in 2 of the ambulances there was some debris that was probably 2.5 to 3 feet, long and probably high, that was propped up on the side of the ambulance there. They were kind of in the shape of maybe like a half a canoe. They were like the front part of a canoe. And, it looked like it might be aluminum, but it looked more like the metal looked more like stainless steel that had been heated. It was blue, kind of a bluish tint to it. But what was odd about it, it looked like around the curved part in the front of the canoe, there was some designs or something. It kind of reminded me of maybe some Egyptian signs or whatever. And it was probably about 3 inches in high, and probably the length of what the wreckage I saw, it looked like it was the length. And the same thing was in the other ambulance too. I mean, I saw practically the same thing. The pieces that were practically the same size, and the insignias looked like whatever that might be was part of the wreckage.
How did your friend feel about what she saw?
Well, I didn't know really until the next day. And I called out. I kept trying to get a hold of her because naturally I was curious and I wanted to know what was going on. And so I called out the next day, and then probably around 11:30, she said, "I know you've been trying to get a hold of me, but I haven't been available." And she said, "Why don't you meet me at the officers club? If you have time, meet at the officers club, and we'll have lunch. And I want to talk to you." And the funeral home we had at that time, we had some of the businesses there had an associate membership to the officers club, and our funeral home had that membership, and also had a card to identify myself and what business that I was, associated with. So I had no problem. One time I'd go to base, all I had to do, a lot of times if it was in the evening, I'd have to stop and sign a visitor's and get a visitor's pass and then turn it in when I left. But it was no problem going out there. So I went on out and met her. Beg your pardon?
Tell me about lunch.
Well, we, both ordered. I'm not sure, remember what we ordered, but it was just a light lunch. But she was so upset. She looked like she was, in shock, is what she really talked like and looked like. And she said, I said, well, I was just curious. The only reason I want to talk to you, I was curious on what happened. And she said, well, you won't believe it. And she says, I don't believe it either. But she said, I got in a lot of trouble on this thing. I'm not real sure about this. But she said, then she pulled out of a little purse or little pocketbook, whatever she had there. She gave me a little diagram that she had drawn some figures of some arms and face and so on. She told me that this is what was in those, that it was a crash. It wasn't an airplane, but they didn't know what it was at that time.
These were bodies.
Yeah, but she said we have 3 bodies. That there was 3 bodies. She said 2 of them were very mutilated. One looked like it might have walked out, or that it, might have lived a little while. and she explained they were like 3.5 feet to 4 feet tall. The two of the bodies were you couldn't identify much because they were practically destroyed, and it looked like maybe that they might have been a predatory animal or something might have been doing some damage on the bodies too.
How did she describe their head and their hands?
Well, she said the head, and then the little drawings that I had, the way she explained it and the way she drew it, that the heads were somewhat larger than a human heads. The hands were long, no thumbs. It was just the long, very delicate fingers at the end of on the underside at the tip of each fingers was a pad-like, maybe a little pad, but it looked like the skin had maybe little suction, like the little suction cups on those. On the no fingernails on the hands. The head, the lips were just a long, narrow, more or less, not full lips like we would have in most of our people, but very fine lined, very fine lips. There was no teeth. That was the inside of the mouth. It was kind of like a real a gums. Maybe it was. She said to explain it. It was almost as hard as if it was rawhide. Maybe, at that. The ears. There was only 2 small orifices on each side of the head with looked like a couple of small lobes that might, some way that might cover both of those. But there was not a protruding ear. And also that the nose, there was only 2 small orifices in the nose. There was really no nose that was convex. It was all just flush with the face.
Was she emotional about all this?
Very much so. Very emotional. She would have to stop and drink water every once in a while, and also she never touched a meal. All the time we were talking in an hour and a half that we were there, she never touched her meal.
Any other demonstrations of emotion? Indications of how she was upset?
Well, just, every once in a while she'd go like this, and wringing her hands, and she said it was the most I've never been so horrified in my life. I've never seen anything so gruesome in my life. I've never smelt anything that smelt worse in my life. And she told me that when I saw her, she was leaving the room to go to the bathroom because she was deathly ill and was going to throw up.
Did she recognize any of the doctors by the examining the body?
She told me, she said, I asked her that question, which of the doctors, and she said, I don't know that I knew them, and that was her answer. So, but she said she walked in the room and they said, hey, we need you, you need to help us. And that was the way she became involved in it. And then she got ill. The doctors also became very ill. They would have to do a little examination, then they'd have to leave and go sit down, and then they would come back and do a little bit more. It was that bad.
After your conversation with her at lunch, can you describe what happened next? How you were unable to see her again, and how you learned the...
Well, yeah, we'd visited a while, and then I had to get back to the funeral home, go back to work, but then I never did see her after that. And I called out the next day to see how she was feeling, and they told me that she wasn't available. Then I wouldn't be available that day. I called the next day, and they told me that she'd been transferred. And it was rather odd because she'd only been at the base less than 3 months. That was her on commission less than 3 months, and that was her first assignment. So it was rather odd that she would be transferred out, within 3 months. So
and later on, you attempted it. I guess you got a letter.
Then about 2 weeks, probably 2 weeks, at least 2 weeks. Could have been a little longer, but I know it was at least 2 weeks. I got a letter addressed to me at Glendennis at the Ballard Funeral Home. With she didn't sign. It didn't have any returned address or anything on it. But inside of the letter, It was just a note. She said, I don't have time to write. I will write later. This is my APO number. And that was the extent of it. So then I wrote back to her and asked her more or less how she was feeling and why the sudden transfer, and then I hoped that she wasn't in any trouble. It was just a short note. I really didn't go into a lot of detail or anything. Then probably 3 weeks or probably a month after that, then I got the letter that I had mailed to her. It was returned. It was stamped return, and also it's in red printing it said deceased. And that's the last time I ever heard anything about it. Then, then I went out to the base a few days later, and I was talking to one of the nurses, and I said, whatever happened to the lieutenant? And she said, well, the rumor is that we heard that she was killed with 5 other nurses in a training mission in a plane crash. And that was it.
No indication of where?
Well, it was in London, England. She said in the note that she sent me that she was in London, stationed in London. And that was it. That's the last time I ever heard.
Do you believe that she's dead?
No, I don't think so. After all that's happening and after, threatening me and everything, I doubt very seriously that she was. I would hope not.
What would you like to say to her if she happened to see this?
Well, if she happened to just see it, if she feels like if she wants to talk, if she feels like I would like to hear from her, yes. See what's been going on in her life and why she wasn't able to contact me. If she, feels like it.
Let's stop tape for a minute. Okay. Now, the sheriff told your father you were in trouble.
Okay, what happened there? Then the next day after I was there, when I had the problem with the officer and the black man, I was told my father was contacted by our sheriff, George Wilcox, which was a very close friend of my father's. They were very good friends. And he called to see if my father was home because he wanted to come out and talk to my father. And he did so, and he told my father that there was a black sergeant from the base that came to his office, was inquiring about who my parents were, my mother and my father, if I had any brothers or sisters, and all, wanting to know what my personal family, who they were and where they were. George said that he knew I had some family, but he didn't know, where they were or anything else. So anyway, he told my father that he did contact my father, and he told my father that he thought I might be in some trouble. And but they evidently didn't explain why I was in trouble. So, first thing my father did was get in his car and come to the funeral home. He said we had to talk because he and I were very close. We were real good friends. The best friend I ever had was my father. He said, I've got to talk. He said, if you're in trouble, he said, we've got to do something about it. And I said, I'm not in trouble. He said, well, you are. He said, George Wilcox told me that you were in a lot of trouble and that you got involved in something that you had no business getting involved in and that you could be in a lot of trouble. And I said, so I told my father the story, and he's the only man that I've ever told this story to until I talked to Stan Friedman and to you people, and that's it, period. And I did tell my father what the story was. Of course, it was unbelievable for him. But then he became very upset, and he wanted to go shoot a few people and all that because they did threaten my life, and so that was the way my father heard about it, and that was the extent of my family. And he never would tell him who my brother, and I had a brother that was a fighter pilot during that time, and I had 3 sisters, and one of them was a nurse. But he would never tell him anything. And so he didn't tell the sheriff or anybody else, because the sheriff was supposed to call him back and give him the names and where they were at, and he wouldn't do it.
Let's get back to your friend. Did she express an opinion as to what she thought these beings were? Did she think they came with it?
Well,
She
the only remark that she ever made was that they definitely weren't humans as we know humans, but they could be from another planet, or the doctors were explaining this, that they couldn't be from our planet. They had to be an alien, or had to be something else, but not in our planet.
She had a phrase she used to describe how they looked to her. You remember that? You were telling me? Like little black Chinamen?
Well, she said that, well, of course they were, first thing she said, they were black. They were just as black as they could be, but probably laying out in the elements in July in Roswell with 105 to 110 temperature every day and 80 degrees or so at night. I mean, that wouldn't be uncommon, because we picked up a lot of sheep herders of people that have been found dead that's laying in the desert, for days and bitten by rattlesnakes or whatever. And they do turn, as black as they can. And I know exactly what they were talking about, because, with the smell and the odor being so drastic, because this is a very unpleasant situation, And
let's talk about their eyes. How did she describe their eyes?
Well, she said that, of course, their eyes were set back into the skull. Oh, and it was I thought it was interesting also that she said their skulls, the doctor said their skull bone structure wasn't like ours. It wasn't actually a bone. It was probably a real heavy cartilage. It looked more or less like a newborn baby. The skull was very pliable. You could mash on the skull and it would, it would give. And so the bone structure, bones not like our bones. It was our skull and everything.
What about the bones in the hands and arms?
Said very fine, very delicate. The arm bones, like the radial and the ulnar and in the arm, that was so fine that he doubted if they could lift. She said they doubt if anyone at that size and the arms at that could lift 50 pounds on the earth or anywhere else. They doubted they had that strength. But she said the one that hadn't been mutilated to a great extent, it reminded him of a real small ancient Chinese person, no hair at all, and very, very delicate skin. In fact, he said the skin would look like they could almost see through it, almost transparent.
Why don't you give me a paragraph on the ears and the nostrils?
Well, the ears, like I think I stated to you, that the ears, there was a couple of small orifices, one on top of the other, with two little lobe flaps, one over the other. They didn't really know if they had any significance, how they worked or what. They didn't go into that. The nose was only a couple of very small orifices, holes right there, just above the lip line. But it had, there wasn't anything covering it. And it was just like two small indentations there, and that was it. Said it was very unusual.
Does anyone else, Don, Carol, do you have anything that you think
You're
we
talking
should
about
add?
the hands. The hands.
Yeah.
Describe the hands.
The hands, well, there was one hand. There was one hand that evidently wasn't attached to the arm. And she said that where she got sick and left the room was that this doctor had the long forceps and picked the hand up and turned it over. And that's when they noticed that there wasn't any thumb. None of the bodies had any thumbs or anything. They were just long, very fine, very delicate fingers, no fingernails. But right at the tip of each finger, it looked like there was a pad. And in this pad, it looked like it might have had very small they were like little suction cups, very minute suction cups. The doctors, that's the way he explained it, that was looking at it.
Let's have tapes right now. Okay.
We need to get the arm as well.
Okay, yes, the
Which
arm.
goes with that.
We need to go about the arm. I'll see to it that we get some dubs of other people's interviews.
I just go to Kmart or wherever and buy the...
I think we have the tape going now. Why don't we start with the thing? How they do
Well,
this?
he talked about the hands, so for continuity, might be good to go to the
Oh,
arms.
this will all be edited anyway, but we can start wherever you like. You want to go with let's start with the arms, okay?
Anytime.
Oh, we don't forget the camera.
Seeing if he was ready.
It's not there.
Yeah,
It's not there.
that's all right.
But you were asking me to describe the arms, and this was another thing that the lieutenant brought out, that it was very the difference between theirs and ours, that from the wrist to the first joint here, that it was probably 1.5 times longer than the top part up here. It was very odd looking. It was very odd, she said. And the very small arms, very small.
Bone structure?
Bone structure. Of course, I asked her about the bones because we were talking about the wrist bones and everything, and she said it was very similar to ours, but the bones were so small that their bones probably wasn't in the arms wasn't any larger than my finger.
Wow.
So
Heavens. Okay, now give me 2 or 3 sentences on how they were dressed. If they were dressed.
we never mentioned it.
Is that right?
Never talked about the dress.
Did she say anything about the sex, or was she able to determine?
She said she really never. She was so sick and everything that never even entered her mind. So that was it.
I guess not.
No way to determine the sex of the beings then.
Well, it wasn't discussed with her. It probably was, but like she said, I was so ill and so horrified that I don't. She said she sat up all night, and she knew I was going to be real concerned. Knew I was going to be on what happened. She knew that I got in trouble probably, and she would. Drew that, she sat up and made little notes on the back of these little prescription pads. And that's what, she had her notes made out, and that's what we discussed, particularly what she had.
I was very interested in that you had kept so many records of the incident and pertaining to everything that you knew regarding the UFO correction. And you kept them in the, there at Ballard's, and then later they disappeared.
Yeah.
Could you give us a
Well,
sense of that?
I was really in charge of all the military contracts. I did all the bids and everything and really took care of all the contracts myself. And that was one of my duties at the funeral home, to take care of the military. And I had a file on everything that ever happened at Walker Air Base, like Bob Hope and some of the big orchestras, and everybody'd come and have the big parties and everything in the hangars. I attended, but I would also have pictures and everything. I had a personal file that I kept, and I kept everything in this file that pertained that I attended or whatever. And this is where I put the diagrams and the notes that she gave me was in my personal file. Well, then the Ballard Funeral Home sold at a later date, several years later, that it sold. And the people that bought the funeral home, these were files they were the old files that they kept in the basement down in the furnace room. And they had I had all the military files together in one filing cabinet. Everything had happened at the base and everything. We also had the contract at Fort Sumner Air Base. They had a glider base there, and also fighter pilot training there, and the P-47s and 51s and so on. And so I had all the files. Everything was one filing cabinet, was strictly all military. And that's where I had all this filed away. I had all this filed away. I even had the newspaper that Walter Haught, the headlines and all this. The next day I had all that in his files.
And what interests me is that out of all these files,
Yeah.
all these different topics, only one was missing when you went to look for it, and that was the one pertaining to this.
Yeah.
Can you review that for us?
Well, no, there were some of the other files were missing also, not just my own file. But my file was in the same, most all of my file was gone. But there was also some files, they had destroyed most of the files that were pertaining after a certain years. They just gotten rid of them. And they told the manager of the funeral home, that's the manager there named Raymond Otero, also told me that he knew my file was there, Joe Lucas, that was manager at that time, knew my files were there. And he and I'd had some personal problems, and he said, get rid of his damn files. We don't want anything that remind us of him. And that's where the files went, really.
There was some discussion about how to preserve the bodies,
Right.
dry ice and that sort of thing, and you kind of addressed
Oh,
that,
well,
where they got the ice and things.
Then the mortuary officer, what would you do if you had to ship one out? And but you couldn't do anything to it. I mean, that you couldn't, do any treatments or anything. What would you do? I said the only thing you could do that I would suggest, that first thing, if you have a problem, don't want to destroy any of the tissue, any blood cells, anything that you don't want to destroy, I would suggest that you contact a pathologist. And I said, I'm sure the Army Airfield, somebody's got some pathologists around. I didn't know that they had one in Roswell, but I said, if I were you, I'd call a pathologist and ask him how he would like to have it done, or whatever you're going to do, or whatever it is. You better do what the pathologist, because he's the one that's going to do the autopsy and make the reports. But I said, the only thing I know you could do is just go to Clardy's Dairy or Sunset Creamery, we had 2 at the time, and buy all the dry ice you can and pack them in dry ice, if that's possible. And that's what I suggest that they do.
Excuse me, Glenn, you're hitting my mic with your
Oh,
thumb.
sorry about that.
It's all right. I've done it at least 8 times
I
already
know it's
this
not
week.
personal, I guess.
No.
Okay, what do you think?
I think as a suggestion, you might want to do that part again if you think you'd like to use it, because
The dry ice?
you probably hit it just a few times. And it might
Oh, sorry about that.
Isn't this a picky business?
Glenn Dennis, take 2, Clardy's
Yeah.
Dairy.
All right, let's go back and go over the dry ice then again.
Well, okay. What I suggested to the mortuary officer, I suggested this to the mortuary officer and we discussed this probably for 20 minutes or better on the telephone. And I kept telling him, hey, if you have a problem, if you got something out there, if you need our services, we have the contract, I would be glad to come out and help you take care of it. And he said, no, this is for future. Kept always referring this was for future use in case we did have something. But then I said, well, first thing you better do, you better get a hold of a pathologist. I don't know whether you have one at the base, but I know you probably have the top pathologist, something similar to those words. And I said, that's what I do, and you better let him give you the instructions, and then you better do what he tells you to do, because he's the one that's going to do the autopsy. And if it's this sensitive, you better do what he tells you. But I said, the only other suggestion I can make, that you go to Clardy's Dairy or you go to Sunset Creamery, buy all the dry ice you can and pack whatever you have, whatever the problem is, you better pack it in dry ice and then do whatever you have to do with it, because that's the only way. They tried to put it in the morgue. Out at the morgue, they had 2 refrigerated body compartments that we used to put them in, and then we'd go out and get the bodies from there. But they always brought the airmen to us, but on the dependents and everything, we went out for them. But they weren't cold enough, and it became so offensive, they were afraid they were going to, upset everybody in the hospital. So they later moved them over to a hangar. And that's the last that she knew anything about them, too. The lieutenant knew anything about them. But she didn't know how they moved it or anything about it, but they were taken to a hangar. Because the odor was so offensive, like they said, it was upsetting everything.
That's great.
So,
Fantastic. Yeah.
Did she ever tell you where she thought or where she was told the bodies went from Roswell?
I'm sorry?
Where the bodies went from Roswell?
Did you know where they were shipped out? Did you know where they went?
She didn't know.
You never,
She never told me. She never mentioned any,
never suggested them.
no suggestion whatsoever. She just said that the last she heard, they were in a hangar, and that's all she knows. And we never discussed anything else.
I guess if that takes care of everything, would you like to watch it?
Or just a portion of it, just to get an idea. You don't need to watch the whole.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's turn it around and watch it.
What do you have? You gotta watch.
No.
This is Stanton Friedman. I'm a nuclear physicist with a very strong interest in flying saucers. I'm in Kansas City, Missouri on July 24th, 1991. I'm here to do an interview with Gerald Anderson, a very important witness with regard to the recovery of a crashed flying saucer in New Mexico in July 1947. We have just had a visit with a polygraph examiner who says he has seen no evidence of deception. This is after spending several hours with myself and Gerald, mostly with Gerald. A full report will be forthcoming. So with that, we will talk to Gerald Anderson. Okay. Enough. You state your name, please.
My name is Gerald Anderson.
Where were you born and when?
I was born October 4th, 1941, in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Okay, and give me a summary of what happened in 1947 with regard to a crashed flying saucer in New Mexico.
Well, we had just moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico on July 4th, 1947. This was approximately the day before we went out on the plains of San Augustine with my Uncle Ted, my cousin Victor, my father, my brother Glenn, and myself. We drove down to the plains of San Augustine, which is west of Socorro, New Mexico, in the Magdalena Daddle area, and we were down there looking for banded and moss agate, which, according to my Uncle Ted and my cousin Victor, was prevalent in the area. My brother, being an amateur rock hound, wanted to get some of this, and it was a way of showing us around the area. And they had relatives down in Magdalena that they wanted to introduce us to. And so we had gone down there, and we got down in the Horse Springs area and had driven off onto the plains down an old rutted road for a mile or so, and seemed like a long ways. We parked the car, got out of the car, and walked down a hillside, a semi forested, I guess you could say. It had pinon trees and scrub oak and stuff like that on it. And we'd walked, well, not scrub oak, but cedar, and walked down the hillside into an arroyo, a dry wash, and then walked south down a dry wash toward where the agates were supposed to be at. And as we came around a bend in the arroyo that had pinon and cedar trees growing on it, we were able to see farther ahead down the arroyo, and on the next ridge line there was a large silver disc-shaped object was embedded in the side of the ridge line, and there was debris and wreckage and stuff strewn about the area, but mainly this thing was intact. I would estimate its size from an adult perspective to be something like 35 feet in diameter. I've heard other people who were there say they thought it was like 50 feet, but as an adult I would say about 35 feet in diameter, quite large. When we got up to it, there were 4 bodies there, not human. There was 2 of them who were obviously dead. One of them that was obviously very badly injured, and one of them that apparently suffered no ill effects, or didn't appear to be injured, and was ambulatory, was mobile, and was just sitting there next to the one that was still alive that appeared to be badly.
Were they right next to the vehicle?
Right next to it, right under the edge of it. And this craft had apparently come in from the east, bounced off one ridge line, went plowing through this arroyo area, and then crashed into the ridge line and embedded itself. And they were sitting back under the edge. It was kind of tilted up like this, and they were sitting back under the edge here. And I'm assuming that this one creature that was all right had laid this material on the ground, but it looked like unrolled tinfoil that these other 3 creatures were laying on, like it was trying, like you do a person in shock, you know, put them on a blanket, kind of a thing. And apparently it had some boxes there around it, and had apparently been trying to give first aid or help these other creatures when we first got there. And as we approached the creature, drew back like this, like it was in fear of us, like we were going to hurt it. And it wasn't very long, you know, trying to communicate with it, the adults were. And it seemed to calm down and just sat there and kind of looked back and forth, watching them, apparently trying to figure out what was going on. Like
What did it look like a little bit more?
These creatures, all of them were about 4 foot tall, 4.5 feet tall. They had very large heads that were shaped larger on the top, and they kind of tapered down. Not to a real sharp point, but just tapered down where they were thin. And they had very large, oval-shaped or almond-shaped, I guess you could say, black eyes. They were so shiny, they had almost a bluish tint to them when the light reflected off of them. Their skin coloration, I think the best way I could describe that is kind of a bluish tinted milky white. It looked like someone in shock. And the ones that were laying on the ground were really looked more that way, more blue,
How about ears, nose, mouth?
No, there was no visible ears on the creatures, except like if you was just to cover your ear like this, to where there was just a rise there and then a hole, without your earlobe and the rest of the ear there.
How about nose?
It was the nose was very small, almost imperceptible, and just like 2 holes straight in, and the lips were just a straight line. Like a cut, and you couldn't see any visible lips like we have. It was just a slit, and
What
they
hair
never made
color?
a sound. Pardon?
What hair color?
There was no hair. They were
Okay.
completely bald.
And no sounds?
I never heard a sound of one, not out of any of the creatures,
It-
including the one that was.
Did you see fingers?
Yeah, they had fingers like this. They didn't have a little finger. They just had the thumb, had 3 extra digits, except the center digit was longer. And the other 2 were about the same size. They were very long and slender. They looked very delicate. And I've made the statement before, and I'll make it again. I think they would have made excellent violinists because of the structure of their hands. They were wearing one-piece suits. All of them were dressed exactly the same, and it was sort of a real shiny, silverish gray color.
No zippers, buttons?
No, I saw no zippers, no buttons.
Insignia?
No insignias. The only thing that was different, they all had this, but the only thing that was different from the silvery gray suit was that down like the seam like it was a seam on the shoulder, and around the collar it was trimmed in what appeared to be maroon, like cording. Then the suits were continuous with their footgear. You could see right about this area down, it seemed to be less pliable than it was up here, like this was a stiffer area, like they were boots or shoes or something. But they were all dressed exactly the same.
Okay, so you and your family are talking back and forth, wondering what was going on. What did your family say? I mean, did anybody say anything?
Yeah, my brother, one of the first remarks I heard made was, that's a goddamn spaceship. There was bodies up there, and I was told not to go up there, which I did. And
how old was your brother at the time?
he was in his early 20s, I think 20, 21, something like that.
He was a lot older than you were.
Oh yes, considerably. When we got up there, I kind of meandered off to one side. This thing was cocked up, and I was standing here. The bodies were here, and everybody else was kind of down here, except my cousin Victor was over here playing and looking in this gaping hole on the side of this disc, and it's shaped just like a discus, except for a round dome was up on top, and there was this big gaping gash in here where you could see inside, and it looked like a double hall.
How big length? The
The
gash.
dome?
Well, the gash.
Well, it covered the greater majority from the center of the craft out. It was just like a gaping hole in there. And I'm thinking, it's like about 30 feet, 35 feet in diameter, so we're talking, 17 feet maybe.
Oh, okay.
And most of that one side was ripped open like that. And you could see inside, and you could see another double hull, in there, and there was these rows of components that was on there, and there was lights that flashed on off. Some of them were steady, some were flashing. There was a lot of debris and stuff hanging out of the hole. There was evidence that there had apparently been fire. It looked like it had been burnt along the edge there. The gash.
Now, this wasn't a gash that could have been caused by the thing coming into the ground. It wasn't at the leading edge of the vehicle.
No, this was in the side, like, it almost appeared, it was elliptical. It almost appeared as if something the same shape as the disc we were looking at had hit that same, had hit the disc and left an imprint that pretty closely approximated the outside diameter of the disc itself. And it appeared to be caved inward.
Okay.
And kind of like, you'd hit it like this and it just crumpled and caved in and ripped it open.
Okay, so you're there, you take all this and everybody's mystified. What were the circumstances outside? Hot, cold?
Very, very hot. Well, to me, being the first time in New Mexico and coming from back east, that dry heat was just like being inside of an oven. It was unbelievable to me. And that was the odd part about this thing. The closer you got to it, the cooler it was. And standing under it in the shade there, next to these creatures' bodies, it was like refrigerated air conditioning. And
did you feel air coming out of this thing? Or
no, it was just like it was ambient. And I remember reaching up and putting my hand on the side of it, and I think I was afraid it was going to hit my head because there was enough room for me as a small child, I was approximately the same size as these creatures to walk up under there and stand there, but I kind of did like that, put my hand up against this thing.
What did it feel like?
It was ice cold. It felt like it just came out of a freezer.
Was it smooth? Was it rough?
It was very smooth. It had a very smooth texture to it. It was obviously made out of metal. It was very solid, and it was very cold, ice cold. And there was a smell in the area. It smelled volatile, acrid, like acetone. And that seemed to be coming out of that gash, that smell. But the closer you got to this thing, the cooler it was. So I kind of remained there, and I guess that while they were over here, my father and my Uncle Ted and my brother, and Uncle Ted was trying to talk to this thing in Spanish, and of course it didn't understand a word he said. And Dad tried to talk to it, and then they tried, sign language, and that didn't work. And I don't know, for some reason, I just, I reached down and touched it, this one that was laying next to me. And when I touched it, I realized, I jumped back. It scared me and startled me because I suddenly realized that these weren't dolls. I thought they were plastic dolls. And I was still in my mind, these are moving dolls. Until I touched it, and I realized, this was a dead thing. I'd seen dead relatives before, and I unfortunately had made the mistake one time of touching a relative that was in a casket, and I just knew this is a dead thing. And it scared me, and I ran around behind my father and my uncle, and this thing was sitting there on the ground, and it kept looking back and forth, and it just had its hands like this in its lap, and it just kept looking back and forth between the three of them, and like it was trying to understand. And all of a sudden it just turned and looked right straight at me between my Uncle Ted and myself. And this is when it was just like an explosion of things in my head, things I started feeling just terrible depression and loneliness and fear and just awful feelings that just suddenly burst into my mind. And I don't know if that meant that it was communicating with me and I was the only one there I could communicate with because I was a kid. I don't know. I turned and ran, and I ran across the arroyo and up on the area that it had bounced off of during the crash, and was just standing there looking down at the scene, and my family, and off in the distance I could see cattle grazing, and I could see a windmill, and I could see dust trails out on the playa, out on the plains out there. And I was there for a little while, and then I came back down, and I guess we were there, Victor was when I got back down there, Victor was up in the crack, and Ted yelled at him to get out of there, and Glenn went over and grabbed him by the belt and jerked him off.
That's your brother?
Yeah, and jerked him off and said, get out of there, you could cause this thing to explode and kill us all, and then of course he went prowling around in there. I was kind of standing off to one side looking. That's why I knew that I could look off these rocks that I was standing on right into this thing. That's why I knew, about the lights and the components and stuff. And then, I heard other people talking. I turned and there was a group of people coming up the arroyo from out on the plains from the south. They had come up there, and of course they walked up and was talking. And
How many?
there was an older man and 5 younger students.
Boys, girls?
There was 3 boys and 2 girls, and they were all, introducing, talking to my father and my uncle and my brother.
What'd the older one look like?
The
Man.
leader of this group,
Yep.
the man, he was a very tall man, very big man. He was wearing a pith helmet when he first came up, one of those kind of explorer helmets. And he was bald, and I know that because he had taken it off and he had done this, a couple times with a handkerchief and put it back on. He was a balding man, and he had a round face. He was very ruddy complected. He's a big man, and he apparently was a doctor because they kept calling him doctor. And as I understand it, was an archaeological group that was out there on some kind of summer thing, and they talked, and he apparently was able to speak several foreign languages, and he tried to talk to this creature several times in different languages, again to no avail.
How did he happen to be there? Had he seen the thing?
Well, they claimed that they said they saw this thing come down the night before, flaming, and they thought it was a meteorite. And they had talked about, well, in the morning, we'll go over there and see this, where this meteor came down, because that's what they thought it was. And when the sun came up the next morning, and they got about their business and got up, and somebody looked over and said, they saw all the shiny metal and stuff across the plains there, and they realized it wasn't a meteorite, it may have been an airplane, and that crashed. So they all decided to go over there and see if there was anybody who was alive, that was hurt, that needed help.
They had driven over?
No, they walked over, apparently, the way I understand it. And it's quite a ways across that plain, so it had to take a very long time to do this. Or they may have had a vehicle, I don't know. That's an assumption, I think, on my part. They walked.
Okay, so they're around with your
But they
family.
came across the plains nonetheless. I'm not sure if they drove or not. I didn't hear any cars.
And then somebody else showed up.
Yeah, they were down there just, 15, maybe 20 minutes at tops, and they were picking up things, some of the students, and this Dr. Buskirk, that they called him, this one girl went up and said, look, doctor, wouldn't this make a beautiful ring? And she was holding what looked like a red rod, or a red tube of some kind. It was kind of a silvery red. And he kind of snapped at her, and put that down, Agnes. You don't know what that is. I think it hurts you. Just don't pick this stuff up. And she kind of said, well, yeah, okay, doctor. And then he went back to what he was doing, and she walked away and put it in her pocket. And a lot of them were doing this, sort of picking up things and feeling things. I was picking up things and feeling things. There was all kinds of material, metal, and stuff laying around. Then we heard it. We all heard it, a sound of a motor coming like a truck. And I went back up the incline there to the ridge line, and I could see out there, and there was a truck coming up. It was an old pickup truck. It was sort of a beige color or a tan colored thing, and it had a whip antenna on it. And it stopped, and this guy got out, and he's wearing brown clothes. He's got boots on, and he's wearing a straw hat, just like the kind Harry Truman always wore. And he had wire-rimmed glasses. He was a big man, and he looked exactly like Harry Truman to me. And I'd seen in the movie Tone News that
he was president then.
Yeah, I was well aware who Harry Truman was, so everybody was. He was kind of a hero, And this guy looked like him, except bigger. And I don't think he didn't look as old either. His hair was kind of light gray. And he walked over there, and they got to talking, with everybody. And he told them that he worked out on the plains out there, and that he made maps, and that he had seen the wreckage from out there on the plains, and he saw the people, and he thought it was a plane wreck, and just something was going on. And he came over there to see. And he hadn't been there but just a very, very few minutes when we heard all kinds of motors and engines straining and stuff. And here comes a military car with a big white star on the side of it, followed by a 6x, which is a military truck with a kind of a canvas wagon type canvas thing over it, and it's full of soldiers. They've got guns, and right behind that was what we call a 4x, which is like a medium-sized Jeep truck situation, and it had two big high whip antennas, all kinds of radio gear in the back, and a guy back there with earphones and stuff on, and he's, you know, working these radios, and they all pulled up and stopped. And
Which direction had they come from?
they came from the north, from the Horse Springs area, right?
So they could have
south.
come off the highway there.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that's exactly how they got there. They come off the highway the same way we did. Well, in the meantime, when it stopped, this black soldier, the sergeant, and the reason I know he was a sergeant, my brother told me he was, and he got out of this car, and then a guy got out on the other side, and Glenn said he was a captain. He told me later he was a captain. And this guy had orange-red hair, and all the soldiers then came running over there, pointing guns at people, and telling them, get away, get away, get away, you know. And when this creature saw these people, the military, he went nuts. He went into an absolute panic, worse than what he did when he saw us.
Did he move around, or just his eyes? Or?
He just
Oh,
went
okay.
crazy, and it was like he was looking
Fearful.
like he was looking for a place to run and hide.
But he never got up.
Never got up. He never left the one injured one next to him. And this red-headed officer, this guy was a real butthole. He made all the threats. He threatened to have people shot if they didn't move
To
away.
everybody?
Oh yeah, get away, get away. You know, we'll shoot. Get away from there. This is a military secret. You know, just screaming and hollering. And he told my uncle and my father that if they didn't want to spend the rest of their life in prison, they would never say anything about what they saw there. If they ever wanted to see us kids again, they'd take the kids away, and they'd never see the kids, you know, meaning me and Victor, that we'd better keep our mouths shut. If we did not, this is what was going to happen. They were threatening people and pushing people. And
The students as well? And Dr.
oh yeah,
Busker?
they were hustling everybody. And one of the soldiers pushed my uncle. He had a rifle, I guess, and he shoved him back like that. Well, that was something you don't do to my Uncle Ted. Ted had a violent temper, and he grabbed the rifle and reached over top and smacked this guy and dropped him right there. And Ted had dropped, fight had dropped the hat. This guy's a cowboy. He'll hit you in a minute. And of course, when he did that, there was bolts opened, and I guess cocking, you know, they were cocking their rifles, and they were pointing guns at people, and everybody, Busker and Glenn and Dad, grabbed him, you know, pulled him back and got him away. Don't, man, they're going to shoot. Don't do that, you know, trying to stop this. And I think we came very close to having someone shot. Then they really started threatening, you know, and they interviewed.
Well, did the redhead do all the talking pretty much too?
Pretty much, except once in a while the sergeant would chime in and make statements like that to other people in response to the redhead. But mainly it was the redheaded.
Was there a name tag?
Yes, there was, and his name was Armstrong. And I'm not sure if I know that from having read it or know that from remembering it, now being able to read it in my memory, or if someone said that to me. But his name was Armstrong, was right here on his uniform.
Now, they chased you guys away pretty quick.
Yeah, they did. And they herded us up like cattle, and they moved us up the Arroyo back in the direction we come from, over the protest of this Dr. Busker, who said, no, we've got to go the other way. We came from over there. I don't care where you came from, get your ass up the Arroyo. And they ran us up the Arroyo. And
So you get to your car then?
right, now they take us up the Arroyo, and just below the hill that we came down, they broke us off and moved us up the hill. Now this whole time, no one has ever frisked us down. No one has ever checked our pockets to see if we picked up any of this material. And this girl, Agnes, still has that stuff in her pocket, and some of the other students had stuff. To my knowledge, up to that point, they had not been searched. Whether they did so afterward, I don't know. They never searched us ever. They run us back up the hill, and when we got to where the car was parked, where Dad had parked the car up there, there's a Jeep with a guy sitting in the back, and there's a mounted machine gun in the back of this Jeep, and all these soldiers. The Jeep pulls out, we're told to get in the car, we follow the Jeep, and the soldiers go with us, all the way back out to the highway. And when we get back out to the highway, they set us right there. They wouldn't let us out of the car, they wouldn't let us move forward. I don't know whether they were making a decision or what. When we got out to the highway, this place was absolutely full of military personnel, military equipment. There was airplanes sitting out there that they had landed on the highway.
Did you see any airplanes when you were back at the site?
Yeah, there was airplanes in the sky, but nobody thought much about it. You know, I didn't think anything about it. I was used to airplanes being in the sky, having, you know, been raised in Indianapolis, Indiana, the home of the Nordum bomb site. You know, the sky was always full of military aircraft. I never thought nothing about it. And when we get back onto the highway, there's observation aircraft, you know, high-winged aircraft, and there's one, what I know now to be a C-47 sitting there, and how we didn't hear that land's beyond me. And how he landed, well, of course, I guess you could land if you're a good pilot out there, because there was no telephone poles or anything. And it was, they had tore the fence down on the north side of that highway, and all this equipment was setting back up there, and that plane was up there, and they were taking stuff out of the plane. There was military ambulances, and there was trucks with wreckers, cranes on them, and there was tankers, like maybe had fuel or water in them. There was just, everywhere you looked, there was military. And
a major recovery operation.
Yeah, it looked like an invasion force. It really did. And they were all wearing these light khaki uniforms. They didn't look like, you know, olive drabs. They were light khaki, and they all had the same patch over there, that kind of blue funny patch with the circles on it was on their shoulder. And
Did you have any clue as to where they came from? Did your brother or your uncle?
No, I don't know where they came from. I don't think anybody ever ascertained that. There were a lot of them had MP patches, and some of them were wearing nightsticks off of these webbed utility belts. They had nightsticks, and they had 45s and holsters, you know, the automatics in a full holster. And these were the people who were given most of the orders. They had the road barricaded off out there, and we sat there for a very long time, and, you know, we were getting thirsty and everything, and we asked, you know, if we could go back to Horse Springs and get some water. Oh, no, you can't go through there. And right after that, they said, no, you just turn around and you head out of here now, and you go to Socorro, and this is a redhead again, you keep your mouth shut, you just keep going, and don't look back. Well, so we drove away, you know, and Dad and I said, hell with it, we'll go to Magdalena, we'll get water in Magdalena, you know, because that's where John Trujillo lived, their relative with Ted. And so as we drove away, I was looking out the back window, and I could see Dr. Buskirk and these kids, and that guy that got out of the pickup was standing there, and this Dr. Buskirk was doing just like this in this redheaded officer's face, and he kept pointing back behind him. And I guess that meant, you know, we got to go back that way, and he was fed up with this guy or something. He was shaking his finger in his face while they were yelling at each other. And that's pretty much the last I saw of the whole situation. I don't know what happened after that, because we just kept going.
Did you get home before dark?
Oh, yeah, it was before dark. Of course, it was in the summertime, so it didn't get dark until way late. And we stopped in Magdalena very briefly, and, you know, and then just kept going. And the adults were really funny, you know, they were really scared. And I had very rarely, you know, well, of course I didn't know him that well, but over the years I knew that Ted was not much of a disciplinarian. He really didn't discipline the kids that much. But he really knocked the fire out of old Victor. Victor wanted to talk about what we just saw. He just saw, and Ted kept telling him, shut up, don't talk about it. Nobody's talking about this. Finally, he just turned around and knocked the living hell out of Victor for shooting his mouth off.
Did Ted work at Sandia then?
Yes, he did. He did something out there in the technical area. I don't know.
Had a clearance?
Yes. And
later your dad worked out at Sandia?
Yes, he did.
Security.
And he worked there for years.
Until he retired?
Until he retired. And Dad had some very high clearances.
Okay.
When we home. Mom was over at Uncle Ted's house, and Mom perceived instantly that something was wrong. I said, "What's wrong, Glenn?" He's again, and then they decided they'd tell him. Well, when they did, then of course Isabel, "Oh my God, you saw demons, you saw the devil," because
Isabel was Ted's wife?
Ted's wife is a devoutly religious Catholic person who thinks anything that isn't a vision of, say, the Virgin Mary or of Jesus is quote-unquote demons, and that's what we saw. And of course Ted, oh God, he just put her off. And we really never talked about it much in the family because of the reaction it got. And my dad was really afraid, and so was Ted. And Glenn especially, because Glenn made the statement about when he first saw the military, he told my father, he said, and Ted and everybody there, "Don't let them some bitches know I'm a Marine. Don't let them know." And of course nobody did, and he was in civilian clothes, so he had a pair of blue jeans on, and he was in civilian clothes, so he didn't look like military, or I'm sure his ass had been in real trouble. And they never checked. They just assumed, I guess, that we were.
Did they ask your names?
Oh yeah, they took our names. They got all that from my dad, and my brother just very cursory wouldn't, just hardly talk to him at all. He let Dad and Ted do most of the talking, which was pretty smart, I think, under the circumstances. And of course, they never really asked me any questions at all.
You were just a kid.
Yeah, I was just a kid. And
well, you first went public with this. Now, let's first square away. All the other four that you were with are dead.
yes.
It's
My
been some
brother-
time.
Yeah, my brother died of a heart attack in Mexico City. My dad died of a heart attack in '78. And Ted and Victor were killed in an automobile accident in the mid-'60s, and I assume it was
Okay.
'65.
Right, now, there's a strange diary that's turned up. How did that happen?
Well, when I went to my father's funeral in 1978, a lot of Dad's personal belongings were given to us boys.
You didn't live in the area at the time.
Oh, no. I
You'd
lived
gone
in-
off to the
yeah,
military.
Yeah, I've been in the military, and subsequently, on return to the military, moved to Colorado immediately. And
Your dad had remarried a couple of times. And
oh yeah, this was
So-
Dad was on his third wife, and his personal belongings and stuff, were kind of given to my two brothers and myself. And my cousin Valley Jean was there at the funeral.
That's
And-
Ted's daughter.
Yes, and she came up and was talking to me, and she said, "Here, you were there. You need to have this too." And she handed me these photocopies. And at first, I thought, well, what is this, Dad's diary? She said, "No, it's my dad's diary. But you were there. You need to have this." And then it dawned on me what I was looking at, and because I read a little bit of it. And so I said, "Yeah, okay," and I didn't want to talk about it at the funeral because Roz's side of the family, God bless
That's
her.
your dad's third
yeah,
wife.
And God bless her, I loved her. But they were very religious, and they would have viewed this exactly the same way as Isabel had, as evil. And I really didn't want to have any problems with them, We were kind of on shaky terms. We didn't see eye to eye religiously, so we're not quite good.
Well, you're active in religion now, aren't you?
Oh, yes.
You're a deacon in the Episcopal Church?
Right.
Okay, that means you actively participate in
Well,
service.
yeah, lay Eucharistic ministry.
Okay.
So yes, I actively participate. I serve on the altar.
What do you do for a living now?
I'm a security officer in the state of Missouri.
And you've been doing police sort of work for several years now.
Oh, yes, about 9 years all total.
And you also are going to college to be a nurse, and you've already got a couple of associate degrees from community colleges.
Right, yes. One associate of science and one associate of general studies, and I'm working toward my bachelor's of nursing. In roughly 2 years, I will have my bachelor of nursing. I'll be a licensed.
Now, to be a security officer, you have to be licensed by the state of Missouri, do you?
Yes, you have to be a certified law enforcement officer, which means that you have to have gone to the state academy, the Department of Public
Okay,
Safety.
so that's not just a
Basic.
pickup thing.
Oh, no, you have to
It's a
attend the
professional,
academy. Yes,
yeah.
it's definite.
Okay.
And you have to work for the state under these conditions, you have to not only be certified, but you have to have prior law enforcement experience.
Now, when we get back to the diary for just a minute, when you were hypnotized by John Carpenter, a psychiatric social worker, and he was asking you questions about the diary, apparently you'd been told that there were a number of copies of that around?
Yeah.
Something buried out maybe there too?
Yeah, as I understood. Well, in fact, in conversations with Valley Jean after the fact, after I got involved in this thing through the Unsolved Mysteries thing, I was told that that wasn't the only diary. That what I had was a copy. Well, it was a photocopy.
Okay.
And that there were a lot of these copies around, and apparently Uncle Ted or someone had put these out through different people in the family and friends and stuff for reasons, I don't know, to keep them from getting lost or something like that. You know?
Okay, now when I asked you for the original, you contacted who?
Well, yeah, Valley Jean.
That was Valley Jean. Okay,
Right.
she was in a convent.
Right.
And she was reluctant to do anything. You had to call a number of times, as I recall.
That's correct.
And you talked to the bishop? Somebody talked to him.
Yeah, I talked to a bishop.
And he convinced her to send the stuff to me.
Yes, apparently.
Okay, because I got it directly from Colorado with a cover letter that strongly indicated that she didn't want any more to do with this. That was part of the agreement. But that she considered this the work of the devil, or words to that effect anyway.
Yeah, I think she's of the same opinion that her mother was.
Okay,
That it
so
was the work of the devil. And you see, all I ever had of this was the photographic copies that I had showed you originally. And as I understand it, you received the original.
I received the
copies,
original
the
from which
originals.
those have been made. They were partly burnt. She mentioned she had intended to burn them, but because of your persistence and with the agreement that I never contact her, she would send them to me. And as you know, when I had forensic analysis done, it showed that the ink dated from the early 70s. The paper could have been available in 47. So it was clearly not an original. But it was also done before there was any publicity about this case anywhere, because I know I was the first one to get involved.
Exactly.
Now, as you know, we have discovered, not I, but you had identi-sketches done by a police artist of the various people involved in this.
Right.
And as you know, there is a picture, several pictures that seem to indicate that Dr. Buskirk was Dr. Winfred Buskirk, who had received his PhD at University of New Mexico. And you had described him as in his late 30s, early 40s. It turns out he was 39 in 1947. He was bald and been bald most of his life, even up to then. Was there other contact between you and he at that time, as far as you knew? Your family and him, or?
I don't know.
Okay, not to your knowledge.
Not to my knowledge. I don't believe my dad had ever contacted him. There's a possibility that Ted may have, and I'm not sure why. I think Valley Jean had alluded to the fact that Ted had been in contact with him, and that they had corresponded and this kind of thing. But as far as any personal knowledge of it, no.
Okay, now you didn't tell your story really until the Unsolved Mysteries program was rerun in January of 1990?
That's right.
That's when you contacted them, got my address, wrote me, wrote
Yeah,
Kevin Randall,
yeah.
and
It was
we're a little
kind of-
upset that the program wasn't quite accurate.
Well, yeah, that was the whole thing. It started off as a fluke to begin with, because everything that I saw didn't jive with what I had seen personally.
Yeah.
And I guess I was kind of miffed, here all these years. I had been primarily forced, by not only by others, but by my own sense of survival to keep my mouth shut. And wow, here it is. It's on TV, and he got it wrong. And so, I just impulsively called the number and told the lady, wait a minute, that whole thing was wrong. Well, how do you know that, sir? And I said, well, because I was there, that's why. And boy, that apparently pulled somebody's string.
Yeah, and the key thing that was wrong, of course, there were a few mistakes in an otherwise excellent program, was that they had that, the Barney Barnett, the civil engineer story, over near Corona, and you knew that it was over in the plains.
Right.
There's a lot more.
Well, yeah, and then the fact that the thing looked like a tin flat hat or a tin top hat, and it didn't. It was dish shape, and Barney Barnett or whoever the guy in the truck was, did not drive right up to it on a road. It wasn't parked conveniently next to a thoroughfare, you know.
Right.
And it was just things like that. And I don't know. I just, for some reason, I thought, well, you know, geez, look.
It's already public.
Yeah, the story's out, and let's get it right, you know. Of course, I don't think I realized at the time, you know, how involved this was going to be, but
What kind of response?
You live and learn.
Now, I got you together with John Carpenter, the psychiatric social worker, and you guys had several sessions, and then we flew out to the site. You're reasonably convinced now that the second time around out there, we did find the exact location.
Yeah, the first time in, it was like 43 years.
And we're in a helicopter, which
I
you never...
Yeah, I was in the air this time, and the last time I was underground. And so, you know, the landmarks were a little confusing. I was positive I was in the right place. But until we actually got on the ground, John and I, and retraced the route in there that we had come in the car, I wasn't absolutely sure. There was 2 ridge lines there, and I wasn't really sure of which one it was. And I had the feeling that the first one that I had pointed out was the correct one, but once I went in on the ground on foot with John, I knew instantly that it wasn't that one, it was the other one, and I'm absolutely positive that that's where I was at. There's no question in my mind.
And you will recall that you described the woman who sold you the pop on the way in?
Right.
And we found the older woman there who said that was exactly what she looked like.
That's right. And I'll never forget that lady because I'd had it with the heat. I'm telling you. Backseat of that 40 Plymouth, down those dirty old roads and stuff, and for mile after mile. And of course, my dad was one of these kind of people. When he got in a car, it was point A to point B nonstop. I don't know why. He just never stopped to smell the roses along the way. And so, you know, I was pretty sad shape, and yeah, I remember that lady quite well.
What kind of response have you had? You went public. I mean, John talked to a newsman. You both talked. He called me. In the Springfield newspaper, paper carried a very straight, very large article, and that got spread around by lots of people. So suddenly you're a celebrity, if you will. What kind of reaction from the people who knew you on campus where you worked, your friends?
Oh, very, very few negativists. There's the noisy negativist, you know. We have those.
But in general, generally supportive.
99% of the people were incredibly supportive. Only one professor at the university was of the negativist type that was vocal about it. Everybody else is just 100% supportive.
Okay.
The majority of these people are absolutely convinced, even without this story, that extraterrestrial life forms exist and that the people are flying around out there and moving between systems and stuff. And it's just an unbelievable amount of support.
You didn't lose your job.
Oh,
your
no.
boss didn't give you a hard time.
Absolutely not. In fact, I think I can publicly say that my boss is extremely supportive because he is a avid ufologist himself. He is fascinated by the subject, and you won't have any problem convincing him either. And my boss has a master's degree. He's not someone that's untrained observer that's given to hallucination. Most of the people who are the most supportive of me are people with very high educations, very, very solid education, very solid, upstanding degree people, not given to hallucination. You
attended a UFO conference with John Carpenter, and he gave a paper, I guess, and introduced you.
Sure did.
And you've got a response from that audience too.
Yeah, 100% supportive. I was really quite relieved and made very, very welcome. And,
well, you've been interviewed by a number of other people. Linda Howe, working on a documentary and so forth, seems to have bought the story now. How much contact did you have with Kevin Randall?
A very brief telephone call. I came home from work one day and there was a message on my answering machine, and as you well know, I have a tendency to be hard to get a hold of.
Yes.
And he'd left his number, and of course I had his address and yours, and I had sent cards to both of you and something to the effect, if you want to know what really happened out there, call me.
Yeah.
And he had called and I wasn't there, and he had left his number, so I returned his call. Now, I talked to him very briefly. Primarily because I didn't like the man's attitude. I don't feel comfortable with people who call other people liars and charlatans and phonies and say that they rig their research to make it come out the way they want. And when someone starts telling me this kind of thing, then the first thing I want to do is I want to get away from them. And this is exactly what I did. Now, I understand that this man claims that I talked to him for 2 hours and that he has a 2-hour tape of one contradiction after another of me, and that's not quite true.
Okay, there's been no other contact with him?
No other contact. I won't give the man the time of day. And
has any other investigator, any of the noisy negativists approached you directly?
no, none at all. The only other investigator is you yourself, or Don Berliner, and Bob Bigelow, and John Carpenter.
Okay.
And of course, you're quite familiar with our involvement.
And you agree that on that first trip to the plains, it was you, I, Bob Bigelow, and a pilot in the helicopter?
Yeah, Joe Channing, the pilot, was in the front seat on the left side. I was in the front seat on the right side. You were directly behind me. No. You were directly behind the pilot on the left side, and Bob Bigelow was directly behind me on the passenger side.
Right, and then we met up eventually with Don Berliner and John
Right.
Carpenter, and
They
we
were
spent
at-
the next 3 days
They
together.
drove to Daddle. They drove the Jeeps and stuff to Daddle, and were waiting for us at Daddle when we landed in the highway island out there.
Right, and as you recall, where did we refuel the helicopter?
Springerdale, Arizona. Because
So
we
it's not
flew to
far
the
to
site.
Arizona, that's the
Oh,
point.
no, it was just a matter of a few minutes, actually. 25 minutes maybe at the max, west of where we were located.
All right, I think we may pick this up another time, but I think that'll do us for now. I really appreciate the time and trouble and effort and all the rest of that, and on to bigger and better things.